Okay, welcome to the next presentation on equity and learning, and this one's focusing more on the cultural nature of learning. So I want to start again by thanking Dr. Suraj Udamchandani for his work in this space, and much of what we'll talk about, especially on the back half of this presentation, comes directly from his work in thinking about equity work in the learning sciences, and his kind of synthesis and just a lot of his thoughts around this. And so hopefully before coming to this, you've already read the Paris. So that was from a previous reading, and that you're able to better understand kind of this idea of culturally responsive and culturally sustaining approaches to education, and in particular feel comfortable with this idea of taking an asset or a resource-based rather than a deficit or difference-based perspective on learners or their communities. And so in this PowerPoint, we're just going to recap the kinds of things that we're thinking about when we're thinking about educational equity. Right, we had this whole, let me just get the whole thing on here. Equality, fairness, access and inclusion, diversity, individualization and personalization within that, differentiation, cultural responsiveness, civic engagement, social justice, carceral justice, justice kind of broadly speaking. And so those are some of the things we're thinking about as we talk about this idea of educational equity. And we had talked about learning and equity and how they're related. And so now we're going to spend the rest of this unit thinking about how we can create more equitable classrooms for learning. So how can we support learning in a more equitable way? So I want to remind you of some of the folks that we've been talking about at different points in this semester. Some we touched on more than others. So others you might be more familiar with, but just to kind of give you a range of these people, we have Skinner and Vygotsky and Bandura and Piaget, and these folks all kind of come from a particular background. Most of them come from a relatively Western background. Vygotsky is kind of the one exception. We could say that he sort of comes more from a Soviet background. And has some Marxism influences that definitely influenced his thinking. But these are all folks whose work is now over 50 years old. Their core first contributions are really old, and Bandura is the most recent in this set. And so in this unit, we're going to start to think about contemporary learning scientists from a wider variety of sociocultural backgrounds. So we're going to think about ideas from those like Naila Nasir, Django Paris, Shirin Vasugi, Chris Gutierrez, among others. And so what I want to mention about these folks is that they're all alive. They're doing this work right now. And so part of why this unit in our course is important is to offer an opportunity to think about and apply kind of these contemporary approaches into our thinking. Before we move any further, I just want to mention that equity-conscious education is always incomplete. It's something we're always working towards. It's not something that we finish and get done. Social circumstances shift all the time, and over the course of your education and your lives, what equitable practice means is going to shift and change with the social and political circumstances, and that's okay. There's a lot that is left unsaid. We're never going to cover everything or speak to every single group or think about all the things that we want to, but that doesn't mean that what we're doing isn't important. And so we're engaging together in this equity-conscious education, knowing that we haven't completed the story. We haven't accounted for everything yet. And so this is part of the dialogue that, that hopefully you started kind of before you came to this class or started to think about, or if this is the first place you're starting to think about it, one that you'll hopefully continue long after this course. Okay, so I had mentioned in our previous PowerPoint or previous presentation that there are sort of 10 major points of departure for thinking about the relationship between equity and learning. And this, again, comes from Dr. Udamchandani's work. And so these are really kind of his thoughts and his kind of 10 major points. So we talked about first, we said that all children have a right to participate in education. Then we talked about these outcome disparities and experiential disparities and how those are organized along social lines. And then we kind of talked about this resource perspective. And you went and kind of dove in with that with the Paris reading. And so in this PowerPoint, I'm going to walk you through the other 7 that, again, Dr. Udamchandani has written about and we're going to just go over them quite briefly. And so then I'll show you which three we're going to read more about in the rest of this unit. So this is meant to be just kind of a survey of some of what the contemporary learning sciences scholarship around politics and equity as it relates to learning processes has been, okay? So there is no such thing as neutral, unbiased teaching or learning. All learning has a political dimension that has to do with the content of learning and the kinds of activities associated with learning. Now, I think this is a really, really important point because there's a tendency for us, especially when you think about it from an educator perspective, to feel like we have to be neutral. That neutrality is a virtue in teaching and learning. But I think this is a mistake. And let me give you an example that may not seem political. Other instructors of this course and I have had extended conversations about kind of what our role is in regards to the content of this course. And initially, and this is several years ago now, we kind of thought, well, our job is just to show some of the major learning theories and then kind of step back and say, okay, we've shown you everything. We're neutral. You pick a learning theory that makes sense to you or a learning theory that most resonates with you. And that can be your approach to teaching or learning. But over time, we realized that part of why you're in this course, instead of just reading a book on this, and because part of our job is to offer you interpretations of the research, right? Our thinking after years of engaging with the material, that's kind of part of what your tuition dollars are supposed to be paying for. And so that's why in the current course, you've probably heard me say multiple times or given thoughts about particular theories. So thoughts about behaviorism or social cognitive theory, that we have to be careful when we're applying those approaches or only apply them in certain circumstances or in certain ways, because otherwise there are real risks involved. And I'm also very happy and open about telling you that my approach to learning is much more aligns with a sociocultural perspective. Now, that might not feel political, but it's that same idea that teacher neutrality is not helpful. And that's really important to internalize. We don't want all of our teachers to be completely neutral. Part of what we want them to do is help us make sense of these ideas through their experiences, and we can also bring our own experiences to it as learners, right? So the idea that teacher neutrality actually supports learning is a myth. Now, of course, teachers should not, just willy-nilly be biased towards particular groups or stop conversations, but that's not the same as not being neutral. Does that make sense? Anyways, we're not going to spend more time on that right now, but just something to kind of think about. Okay, learners are always contending with social and cultural storylines about who they can or cannot be. From a young age, you receive cultural messages about what is possible and what is not for somebody like you. And we'll dive into that in one of the next readings, so I won't say any more about that. But this is where something like maybe stereotype threat might come up. For those that are familiar with that concept, something like that plays in. Okay, and I want to mention that cultures are heterogeneous. Students' demographics matter less than their cultural repertoires of practice. So we're not just talking about demographics, but we're talking about repertoires of practice. And let me explain what I mean by that. So I recently watched a documentary about the spelling bee on Netflix. And it was talking about how many children of Indian descent make it to the finals and even win. So there's all of these Indian children that are doing super well in the spelling bee. And they kind of showed all of part of this was this documentary of, being in their homes. And now it's not the case that because someone is Indian, they're good at spelling. Right? Not all of the kids in a particular family were good at spelling, or not even all of their family and friends who were also Indian were good at spelling. Sticking to this positive stereotype, right? But it doesn't mean that they're good at It doesn't mean that they're good at spelling just because they're Indian, because not all Indians are good at spelling, right? We're talking about over 1 billion people. Over 1 in 7 people on Earth. Surely there's a wide range, and it's not some gene that India has some extra gene that makes them a better speller, right? So rather it has to do with the cultural repertoires of practice of individuals. Like, what is my repertoire of practice? Meaning, what are some of the things that I feel really comfortable with when I arrive at school? Because those are the kinds of things that we do in the cultural context of my home and my upbringing. So all that to say, we really want to resist the urge to homogenize cultures and say, because student X belongs to group Y, they are good at X or bad at Z, right? Instead, we want to say, it seems like student X has this background to engage in the practice of Y in a culturally specific way. And that might help them understand to see differently, or that might open up a new conversation about Z with that student. Okay? Do you feel that, that difference there? Okay, next one, heterogeneity, which is to say diversity of both people and their ideas, is a fundamental resource to support learning. There's really nice writing around this idea, and so it has to do with this, with a diversity of people, meaning like, a diverse classroom with various races, genders, etc., present in the classroom. That's going to create a nice learning environment in terms of people having different backgrounds so that they can share with each other, but also just sharing or being exposed to different ideas. Of course, people come to the readings, they come to the curriculum with a really wide variety of experiences and backgrounds. And teachers should design learning environments that use that variety to support learning. So that means you validate a wide variety of perspectives, but also you help students engage with one another's perspectives. That's the kind of thing I'm hoping we're doing kind of in the annotations, right? So heterogeneity or diversity fundamentally supports learning. It's really, really key to learning, particularly when we think about learning as trying to understand the world in new ways. Okay, educational equity has systemic and interpersonal components, and those systemic components are really, really important. But I think it's also perhaps more actionable for us, for those that are thinking about teaching and also learning, to think about the interpersonal components. And by that, I mean, like between me, the teacher, and you, the student, right? There's a matter of equity at hand, and how you talk to me and how you treat me and orient to my ideas is part of educational equity. And so this one, we're also going to do a little bit more reading around. So for example, you should take children's ideas seriously, orient to students' ideas seriously, offer intellectual respect to students in your conversations with them. And again, it's something that I will continually be working on, and I'm trying to make sure that our conversations have that intellectual respect. But it's something that I'm constantly working on as well. Okay, so ninth departure for us is that people do tend to learn in similar ways. But what causes that learning to unfold varies significantly. So teachers should design with all learners in mind. And this draws in ideas from universal design for learning, designing for different kinds of ability and disability levels and orientations. And we also need to think about how we engage this question of everybody learns differently, right? Or how everybody learns differently. And so I'm going to actually kind of pin this one for the last PowerPoint in this module that you'll come to a little bit later. Okay, and then finally, if we believe that the point of education one of the things that we believe is that education should be liberatory, right? If we believe education is a practice of freedom, then education must focus on the analysis and transformation of social circumstances. This is reflection and action on social circumstances. And this is something called critical pedagogy. And you might have heard of it. And Paulo Freire, among others, is kind of considered one of the big figures in this. We won't focus on critical pedagogy anymore in this class, but if you remember from a couple of presentations ago, I talked about this idea of equity in learning and then learning as equity, equity in learning and then learning as equity. So for me, that's what we mean when we say learning as equity. Like if I were to take a critical pedagogy perspective on this class, like maybe what we would do is really explicitly together try and do some sense making around surveillance software for exams or K-12 policies for virtual learning, like we talked about, and thinking about what that means for education and learning and all that kind of stuff, because that would be a way for us to engage in an analysis, a critical social analysis of what's happening. Okay, so there you have it. There's 10 points of departure for thinking about equity and learning from the contemporary political perspectives on learning, from the contemporary learning scientists, right? And contemporary learning sciences. And I know that's sort of overwhelming. So let me just say 1 and 2 we've talked about, 3 you read about. And then what we're going to do in the rest of this unit is simply focus on 5, 8, and 9. So I want you to think about social and cultural storylines and what those mean for teaching and learning. And that's where we'll go to next. Then I want you to think about understanding and designing for students with disabilities and universal design. That's kind of in number 9. And then I want you to think about intellectual respect and interpersonal relationships with students. And that's going to be number 8. And so that's what will form the rest of this unit.